Right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to PPM's POPIA webinar. We're hoping to help you to get your organization ready. We don't have too much time. You might think that you have another 11 months, but the reality is that in our experience, 11 months fly really quickly. So the objective of today's webinar is to take you through very practical tips on how you should be getting ready. We're not going to give you an academic exercise. We're not going to look at a lot of definitions, but we're basically going to take you through those aspects that we, in our experience over the past few years, think are really important for your organization to focus on. So whether you're a big organization or a small one, we think whatever it is that we'll tell you today is going to help you to get ready. What we would urge you is that from now, you really start your process and your journey to get ready for POPIA. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to the next slide and tell you what we're going to be doing today. So firstly, a brief overview of POPIA. There might be some of you who, one slide back. Okay. There might be some of you who haven't had an in-depth look at POPIA. Some of you might be encountering it for the first time because you've heard that you need to get ready. So we're just going to take a high-level look at what you might need to know. We're then going to give you an overview of how you need to get your house in order. And we're very lucky today, we didn't say it in our flyer, but we have two guests, both of whom are really top of their game in this sector, and both of whom are guiding their organizations through the POPIA compliance process. I will introduce you to them a little later, but they're on standby, and we've sent them 10 questions, which I will read to you before we introduce them, and they will address those questions to the best of their ability. Of course, recognizing that some aspects might be a bit too sensitive because their organizations are quite prominent, but let's see how much they're willing to disclose. After that, we'll take you through the process of how you plan your privacy governance program. The next step is you will need to design one. Remember, planning, designing, they're slightly different processes. So it's important that you understand what each process entails. And then I think what's very important as well is as one of the CIA directors, I think it was a CIA or FBI director said, insofar as cyber breaches are concerned, he said it's not a matter of if, but it's rather when it happens. So it's crucial that you have a plan in place to make sure that when your data breach does happen, that you're able to handle it speedily and competently. We've seen cases where cyber breaches, data breaches have been handled really badly, and there have been some serious consequences. So hopefully with the tips we give you today, you will avoid those consequences. So POPIA, a brief overview. Some of the terms that you would need to know: personal information, that's information that's identifiable to any person. Data subject, the person to whom the information relates. The responsible party, the person who determines why and how information is processed. The operator, a person who processes personal information on behalf of the responsible party. So you have the responsible party, and then you have somebody else who might be a subcontractor that will handle personal information on behalf of that that responsible party. A simple example that I can give you from a recent incident was Nedbank and its outsourced service provider who was responsible for certain marketing aspects. And you'll remember that there was a breach there as well. So processing any operation performed on personal information, and the information regulator, the body created to regulate POPIA. And remember, its job is not just to carry a big stick. It also has a role in educating the public. As far as they're concerned, they are essentially ready to enforce and monitor. And that's why from the 1st of July, we've had POPIA become fully effective. We were essentially waiting and making sure that they are ready to do their job. So very quickly, just 9 points that we'd like to highlight. So we're not going to dwell on the Act too long. We're actually going to get into the practical elements as quickly as we can. But let me take you through these 9 points. Importantly, you must have a legal basis to process personal information. You can't just process information for no legitimate reason. Make sure that you have a legal basis to do that. Every organization requires an information officer. In fact, the Act says that whoever the head of that organization is, that person is automatically the information officer. So as far as businesses are concerned, we all want to market. So make sure that direct marketing is done in accordance with POPIA, and it's allowed in certain circumstances the way you do it. There are 8 conditions that must be adhered to. Familiarize yourselves with them. The first one, accountability, is probably the most important, because it essentially says that you need to get to know POPIA and make sure that whoever's in your organization also gets to know it. There are strict rules regarding children and special personal information. That is sensitive information that is defined in the Act. So if you suspect that you're processing special personal information, or if you are processing the personal information of children, take a close look at that section, at those sections. You don't want to get into trouble and onto the wrong side of the information regulator. As I mentioned earlier, the information regulator, that's point 6, monitors and enforces POPIA. If you have to ask me, I think the information regulator has been waiting a really long time to get going. And when they do get going, I expect that they're going to be really enforcing the Act. So be aware of that and know that you should get prepared and be compliant before the 1 year is up. Data breaches, when they happen, there's a particular sequence and there are certain requirements that you need to follow. Familiarize yourself with that. We will talk about it a little later, but that is also quite important because there are timelines that apply to the responsible party. That's the main person. And there are also even more stringent timelines that apply to the operator, that is the subcontractor. So be aware of that. Non-compliance has some serious offenses. In this instance, and I tell boards all the time, that it's not going to be the IT guy, it's not going to be the head of HR, it's going to be the head of the organization that is going to take the fall for any breach. So the board or the executives in charge need to be aware that they are going to be responsible and they won't be able to shift the blame. Privacy policies and procedures, which we'll touch on later, are absolutely crucial. So that in a nutshell is an overview of POPIA, not using legal terminology, but just giving you practical tips on how and what its contents are. So this is always one that I never leave out. There are a couple of exclusions. You need to know that as far as the processing of personal information is concerned. And we've basically set down a few here. Personal or household activity. When you process personal information at home, the one example I give is of the list that you would probably put on the fridge. So in our household, we have a shared list. I put some things on and my wife puts some things on. Typically, there's always a lot more for me. And if I don't follow the list or comply with whatever it says, I get threats. I say this is it's not subject to POPIA, and my wife says, "Are you more afraid of me or are you more afraid of POPIA?" So I make sure I comply with that list. But yes, household personal processing of personal information in households, that is exempt. De-identified information, that is information that where you absolutely cannot identify any data subject. So whether it's a company or an individual, that is not subject to POPIA because you can't identify who that person is. National security. The example I give is in instances, take the emergency recently, the national state of disaster. In this instance, the state has proposed, I don't know how far or what stage the situation is with monitoring contacts using apps and technology. But in that instance, there's a strong likelihood that the state will argue that processing that information is exempt from POPIA. So that's an example of national security or national emergency. Journalism, art, and literature. I'm sure very often you've seen a picture of somebody in the newspaper, perhaps standing outside their gate. In that instance, the individual wouldn't be able to object simply because that is for journalistic purposes. So be aware of those exemptions and just keep them in mind as you go through your planning. So how to get your house in order. Now, you might ask yourself, and this is a refrain that I've heard many times from clients, is why do we have to have another law? We've got the National Consumer Act, we've got a whole lot of other pieces of legislation. Why do we have to comply? Well, in this instance, believe it or not, there are benefits to complying. Remember, personal information is an asset, and that's why people have been given control of it and how you use it. So if you treat it well, it can benefit your organization. It also provides a way to enter into the information economy. If you're dealing with information properly, you'll get a lot more respect from people whose personal information you are handling, and that way it'll enhance your business. Protecting your reputation. Think of those entities that have had breaches. They are less trusted than those who can give a solid promise that personal information will be protected and treated in accordance with the law. There are cost savings. Imagine what happens when you have a breach. You've got to hire PR people. You've got to hire lawyers like Lucian. You will probably pay fines in the end and penalties. Those are huge expenses that you can avoid by complying. And of course, you want to portray yourself as a lawful organization, one that complies with the law. So those are all the benefits of implementing a POPIA compliance program within your organization. So how do we comply? Well, there are a couple of steps, basic steps that if you follow them, you're sure to reach a stage where you are probably going to be essentially compliant with POPIA. You start out by assessing the situation within your organization. You look at what information you're processing and get a good idea of the lay of the land. The next step you should take is plan. How are you going to go about complying with POPIA and implementing a privacy program within your organization? Then you develop the program. So put together the steps that you're going to take, put together the policies that you're going to need. And the next step, of course, is implement that policy. Make sure it is done properly. Follow the required steps, which we'll get into shortly. And then once that system is implemented, make sure that you monitor it. There's no point in drafting privacy policies, data destruction policies, retention policies, etc., etc., etc. And they simply go into file 13, and everybody who might have gotten some initial training lapses into their old bad ways. That's not going to help your organization, because when the breach happens, it's not going to be a defense or an excuse that you had this program and you once put people through training. So monitoring is crucial. It's got to be regular and consistent. The last step, of course, if I could call it that, is how you react when an incident happens. We've seen instances, as I mentioned when I started, where organizations just went through the process of reacting in a very haphazard way. And that resulted in them exposing themselves from a legal perspective and also from a reputational perspective. And in addition, how you deal with it in terms of dealing with the public and dealing with the press, that matters as well. So remember, if you plan this process in its entirety, you're likely to have a much better experience and fewer problems as far as compliance with POPIA is concerned. So I think what's important for us is to get some input and a bit of a few tips from people who have been through this process, who are really knowledgeable in this sector, who are really respected. And that's before we get into the nitty-gritty of what you should be doing to get your organization ready. I'm going to introduce right now, and I'm very pleased and honored to have these two specialists and experts in their field who are going to speak to us shortly. We've got Imran Karwa, who's Information Security Officer at Turvest, somebody who's been in this sector for years, who's worked for some pretty reputable organizations, who is knowledgeable and a regular commentator on various media. Dr. Peter van der Walt, Data Integrity Manager at Discovery, somebody who sits on a few organizations and is immersed in the sector, very knowledgeable. I tap into his knowledge every now and again, and I'm very grateful to have him as a contact. We're going to start with Dr. Peter van der Walt. He's going to take us through the 10 questions that we're going to ask him, that we've asked him. I'm not going to repeat them right now, but over to you, Dr. van der Walt. Welcome. And yes, we look forward to hearing what you're going to say.
Morning, Lucian, and morning to everybody else. No, thanks for the opportunity. You say you tap into my knowledge frequently, but I think I do more to your side than you do to me. So yes, Lucian, from a privacy, or let's call it in the POPIA implementation side of things, what I look at within Discovery, I'm responsible for data governance and privacy. And more recently, we've also adopted our internal structures from where it was purely focused on privacy or data governance or information security or cyber security. We've now aligned to be much more information governance focused, and to take a holistic approach around privacy, data, etc., security, of course, and so much, so that we have a integrated approach around all of these aspects as we go forward. So I joined Discovery around 2018, and by that time the program was already in swing. And I believe the group has started already in 2014 to start setting some foundations with regards to addressing some of the concerns. But as you know, due to the Act not fully being in place at that time or leading up to now, there's always been this lack of urgency, not really wanting to commit spend resources around some of the initiatives, etc. But I must say I've noticed a significant increase in urgency, and now we need to do something more specifically, more focused, etc. In the last couple of months, not to say just from the 1st of July. Our team is structured firstly from a privacy steer, what we call our privacy steerco. That has an executive sponsor that chairs that particular meeting. There's a variety of expertise on that particular committee, including, of course, group compliance. There's our CISO. There's from all our business units, we have representation from our chief operating officers in terms of making sure that execution of the respective requirements does get place in their areas. Of course, IT, group risk, internal audit, etc. So it's a broad range of subject matter expertise, etc. And to say it's not an IT project. It's not IT that drives it. It's not IT that's going to make the decisions. It's a business decision-driven initiative. Yes, IT, of course, has got a very important role to play in this regard, and we should obviously not discount that. But it's always almost a method to a means type of approach or view on that. Yeah. In terms of your questions, I just want to go through. So in terms of foreign privacy laws, absolutely, GDPR is one of our key, I can say, requirements, as well as we, from a group perspective, also provide services to some of our offshore operations within the UK, within Europe. Our clients, some of our major clients are in Europe, but Peter, there's also the US.
Just before you go ahead, I know that you were looking pretty good this morning. I see you don't have your camera on.
If excuse me. You can
Sorry,
my apologies. My apologies.
There we go.
So yes, so from an international multi-jurisdictional perspective, yes, we have obligations towards GDPR, etc., and our UK operations specifically. But then, as I've said, some of our major clients are in Europe. And so we have to look at those type of jurisdictions as well. And with that, it does bring some practicalities around, so who takes precedent in terms of some of those areas that we need to comply with. And we're more and more now looking at implementing or looking at this approach around a privacy framework as opposed to purely just complying with GDPR or purely just complying with some of the international requirements to make life easier. Just to say, that will help us drive that particular area of concern. You've asked record of processing in progress. Excel email is not a sustainable solution. Doing privacy impact assessments, doing data subject requests, those type of areas, trying to understand where your data assets are. Manual will only do up to a point, but from there on, you need something to help and assist you to look at it holistically from a data discovery perspective, from managing information requests, etc., especially in a large organization such as ours, which has got a multitude of systems, data assets, people, third parties, etc. And more and more, my leaning is towards looking at integrated solutions around this space. But having said that, it also brings issues of cost, because most of these systems are overseas based. But ultimately, to make sure that you understand where your data assets are, who's the third party you're dealing with, where's the data processed, and trying to get a platform that helps you to collaborate with not just our South African people here, but also our counterparts in the UK or Europe and the US to also learn from their experiences and to understand that if there's jurisdictional or geographical flow of information, that we see where that information is going and trying to understand potential risk and impacts. If we process information in Argentina versus Brazil versus the US, it just creates a lot of complexity. From a framework perspective, yes, we subscribe to primarily NIST, the cybersecurity framework within our information security space. And now I'm bringing in the privacy framework from NIST as well to align with some of the work that's already been done and that we already track and report on with regards to a framework approach. And of course, there's underlying ISMS standards, ISO 27000, 27701, etc., that we all look at making sure that those are also in place. From a third-party perspective, and I think like you've mentioned in the example previously, that's our biggest, and I'm sure any other area's biggest risk around what is our third parties doing with our information. Yes, we may have an agreement in place. I think that's just part of the puzzle, but the actual operational oversight of those particular agreements is a main concern. We can say we've sent you 100 records, but did you receive 100 records? Where's the other 10 that got lost in transit, etc.? Yes. As somebody put in necessary controls in the third-party space, if they got the controls in place. So with that, what we do is, yes, we do privacy impact assessments to make sure that from a alignment with the Act itself is taken care of. Yes, agreements are in place. And yes, we do have capacity, because that's also an issue. We actually go on site to the third party, check for necessary controls, etc., do pen tests even to make sure that those type of things are taken care of. But it's time consuming and it's resource intensive. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So that's something I'm sure, Peter, that many organizations forget to do, because as much as POPIA says that you need to have an agreement in place with the service provider, there's another step which includes actually going to make sure that they can deliver what they promise from a security perspective.
Absolutely, and I mean I guess that's the Achilles heel, where you need to make sure that you cover those areas. That a contract gets drawn up, both parties agreed to it, and then it gets filed in some kind of contract management system. But who actually now goes and checks the data that gets shared across? Is it sort of then left once that contract expires or the relationship expires? Then what happens? In terms of the closing of the loop perspective as well. From a data subject access request, volumes are low at this stage, and it's primarily driven access requests. Yes, I deal with POPIA requests, I deal with subpoenas, I deal with SARS requests, etc. But those are low at this point. But what I have seen is that Joe Public is definitely realizing that they've got certain rights around their information, asking for information that we have on record about them, and we are obviously under obligation to give that back in terms of their requests. The challenge, of course, there where you've got a myriad of systems, legacy up to say 20 years plus, archives, etc., is to actually get hold of this information in a reasonable time, as the Act says, and to package that so that the user or the person can actually consume that again. Because you've got to take into account that there's recordings of voice calls, there's scans of application forms, there's bank account details or transactions, there's GPS coordinates, etc. There's vitality health checks. There's a myriad of other aspects that you've got to keep into account when these type of request comes into your mailbox. And the challenge there is, once that volume increases, it's going to place a burden on companies also to disclose that, because sometimes it's just a test to see, can I get something out of the company, or there might be a very valid reason for that particular request. So I think that's going to have a definite impact in terms of your resourcing, systems, etc., that you need to consider. Privacy awareness, yes, we've got a very active cyber awareness program. In fact, to such an extent that we require our employees to undergo a number of quarterly online training modules. And when we were still in the building, if you did not complete your training, your internet was cut off as an incentive.
That's definitely something that's going to make compliance.
But the challenge, of course, now is I don't have access or control over your work from home situation. So we're trying to see what other incentives there could be to make sure that the people do still have their training done. We do record that, we monitor that purely from a, not just from compliance perspective, but just also trying to see where there's potential areas for additional training required, etc., especially in our call centers, especially people that deal with very sensitive information. And yes, it's practical things like what do you do with a phishing attack? What do you do with those information sharing, destruction of information, etc. So it's all trying to be practical examples in terms of how we need to handle information. The data breach question, yes. So we simulate at least once a year. We simulate an event, and that then includes that we have the executive participate in that. So from Adrian Gore down into all the operations, we actually simulate an event and we test to see what the response is. And what we've learned over time was that to make sure that your roles and responsibilities for a particular situation is clearly defined, that we know who needs to talk to whom when it comes to outside stakeholders, inside stakeholders. And what we've also learned is don't create any expectations especially for those outside stakeholders to say, look, we had a breach, it affected X number of company data subjects, etc., etc. Rather get your investigation done as much as you can up front, because the damage or the implications might not be big as you might have thought initially. You know, we all of a sudden, you know, we all in a flat spin, everybody's in some kind of crisis mode, and we had a breach, and it's sort of, oh, you know, everything's going to come down now. Go back, take it, you know, stay calm. You know, that's something we need to keep into account. Stay calm, make sure that you understand what's happened properly, and only then start to make informed decisions as opposed to an emotional knee-jerk reaction. We've got an entire team at an executive level that is involved in that. So it ranges from legal, from risk, from compliance, forensics, etc. And of course, engagement with the data subject from a public relations perspective. SOPs are defined. Like I say, we test that once in a while, and out of that testing and potentially even an actual event, we try to learn and update those SOPs to make sure that this didn't work this time, we could have done it better, or hang on, we forgot about something else. And it's trying to make sure that.
Sorry to interrupt, just for the attendees, SOP, standard operating procedure.
Correct. Yeah.
Great.
And then even you know, post the event to assess and see what happened, what could we have done better, who's keeping the evidence if needs be, and we've got processes around that. So listen, you know, ultimately it's to make sure that you've got those role players defined up front. They understand what their responsibilities are, and to test the waters once in a while, just you know, go through the motions again to get that some kind of muscle memory in place, so that in the event that you get a call at 2 o'clock in the morning, we know what to do, and just to make that clear. Overall, yes, we've got an active program in place. A lot of focus around some of the elements with regards to the Act from a risk perspective. So initially, our approach was understand your baseline, understand where the gaps are, and focus and prioritize on those areas. So at the group level, we've got key focus areas that we want to deliver at a group level. Each business unit still remains responsible for some of their areas. And it literally comes down to what we've done, just to make it practical as well for the business units, is I've actually broken the Act down almost by sentence, and to understand what are the implications of each of those areas and how do we apply specific controls. I mean, just on condition 7, to give you an example, it says internal, external risks. Yes. What does that imply for us? How does that translate into a security process, or how does that relate to a policy process, etc.? And just to make sure that we can see from that perspective, we understand what is the requirement, what is our maturity in that particular area. Is it just a policy, or is it something that we still need to automate or get to a point where we want to have it automated, i.e. a level 4 or a level 5 maturity scale? And let's say, guys, let's do this and understand what's our baseline and understand what's the expectation to get to a compliance state eventually over time. It's not going to happen overnight. We all accept that. There's culture, there's people, there's process that we need to also take into account. And my objective overall is to make sure that when people give their data to us, they can trust us with the processing of that data, that it's lawful and it's ethical, and that thinking needs to translate back into our employees, and also that they understand they're custodians of the person's data. It's not our data. We cannot continue, you know, to say, yeah, it's our data. We can do with it whatever we want to. That cannot be done. And those are things we need to take into account. Data is a very, very valuable asset. We know that people are out there looking for data. They'll steal it. They'll buy it. They'll do whatever. And we need to ensure that we inculcate that trust and level of custodian stewardship into our business as well. That's it from me.
Great, thank you. Now, I like the way you ended off. You know, the fact that what people are looking for is trust. They want to know that the data that they entrust you with, some of their very sensitive information, is going to be taken care of and you're going to do your utmost to ensure that it doesn't end up in the wrong hands. So I think that is exactly what people want to hear. And I'm also grateful for you for sharing so much of what you are doing within your organization. You're a very large organization, but I think generally the principles that you've told us about can be applied to any organization of any size. So I hope that what you've told us today will certainly be taken to heart by all those who are attending. Before we get over to our next guest.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Peter. You have a good day, and we hope to see you again at one of the events, and look forward to your comments on LinkedIn and all the other social media where you provide such useful information. Take care and have a good day.
Thank you, Lucian, and have a good webinar further. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Take care. Before we get over to Imran, please look out for questions in the Q&A panel. They will be in caps. See if you can answer them. Very simple questions. Whoever answers one of those questions is going to get one of our Plan for POPIA guides. So make sure, even if you put a question mark or a smiley face, that's going to suffice. From a privacy perspective, I can assure you, the only thing we'll use your data for is to send you the Plan for POPIA guide and nothing else. I can assure you that. Now we're going to start with somebody who I love following on LinkedIn, a very practical, forthright person who tells it like it is. Sometimes we think, wow, that's very controversial, but after you've had an opportunity to consider what Imran has said, you realize that actually, he's speaking absolute sense, and in time you soon find that everybody gravitates towards that particular position. So definitely a thought leader in this particular field. So I'm going to hand over to Imran. He's going to address similar questions to Peter. And if you have any questions, please put them onto the Q&A, and we'll try and address them if we can, either when Imran is done or at the end of the webinar. Over to you, Imran.
Hi, Lucian. Thanks for having me on your webinar. This is fantastic. It's always a great morning when I'm sharing a platform with Lucian and Dr. Peter van der Walt, I have to say. I think you may have slightly oversold me and my skill set, unfortunately, but I will try my best to respond to some of the questions and try not to overlap too much on what Peter has said, given that he's actually a doctor. And I'm just a lawyer, so I'll try my best to get through it. Firstly, I'd like to say, good morning, hello to everyone on the webinar. I'd like to offer a pragmatic and practical approach to POPIA compliance. I'm responsible for implementation within my organization. My name is Imran Karwa. I'm the Information Security Officer at Tuavest Retail Services based in Johannesburg. We've got operations across continental Africa as well as in Europe as well. I'm responsible for information security, cybersecurity, data protection, and privacy across my organization. The team that I manage at the moment is fairly small, and what I'd like to provide insights on is a smaller perspective for smaller organizations, for organizations without an established privacy function, unlike the likes of your big four banks or top consultancies and organizations of that magnitude and size. So what I can do is I can give you some practical insights into this. When I joined Tuavest about a year ago, they had done a little bit of groundwork in terms of POPIA, but the implementation needed much work. What I decided to do was look at it, re-look at it from a baseline perspective, look at what we had in place, look at the gap reports, the impact assessments that consultants had done for us previously, and then start actually implementing the action steps that they've asked us to do. So in the space of a year, I've actually knocked off most of the implementation actions that they've asked us to do, and that's helped me a lot in understanding privacy, because it's allowed me to actually see what, for example, encryption looks like in an organization. And many consultants will say, encrypt all your data because it's a requirement of POPIA, and that's not true, and that's disingenuous to begin with, because encryption is a difficult measure. There's a lot of complexity involved. You've got to encrypt data at rest and in motion. You've got to look at the technology that you're using, and you've also got to consider that encryption itself might not meet the requirement of security standards in a few years' time with machine learning cracking encryption. So that's not a complete solution, and it's not an end solution that you can offer to anyone. So it is a solution that we have at the moment that we can use, but it's not the only one. That said, in terms of my team, it's a very small team. There's a lot of cross-functional capacity being used for privacy. And thankfully, we're able to manage it across our organization, given our limited resourcing. Whether we are subject to privacy laws like the GDPR, that's a pretty big one for us, because we focus primarily on in-flight retail services. So we're subject to privacy laws as well as I guess, privacy regulation that comes from the banks that we work with and the card issuers that we work with as well. So one of those standards that we need to meet is the PCI DSS. It's the Payment Card Industry's Data Security Standard. And if it's possible for me to share my screen, I can just, show you what that looks like.
Please go ahead.
So what I suggest most organizations do is the first thing you put together is a privacy landscape, and you look at all the privacy touch points that you have as an organization, so that you know what you need to adhere to and what compliance requirements apply to your specific business. And for us, this is what it looks like. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
If you want, you can put it in slide mode.
Yeah.
But it's either way, it's fine. Perfect.
So this is what it looks like for me, and this is what I've put together for my organization. Of course, POPIA being the most important, being that it's now in effect, as well as us being an organization based primarily in South Africa. Of course, we have offices in the UK as well, which is why the GDPR is just as important for us, and which is why we need to ensure that we are GDPR compliant as well. A lot of our data subjects are European citizens or reside within the European Economic Area, so we need to be compliant with that as well. The third one being PCI DSS compliance, and the risk for us of losing PCI compliance status is that we lose our card merchant status and we cannot process card transactions. So that's a business critical requirement for us, and it's one we need to absolutely meet. And then, of course, we've taken on the ISO 27000 standard as the benchmark that we need to meet, and that answers the question that Peter also looked at. He's obviously going with the NIST standard. We found that ISO 27000 is a better fit for our organization, and I'm mapping that currently to ISO 27701 as well with the privacy standard. And then, of course, we've got privacy regimes across continental Africa as well, because we operate in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, and a number of other African jurisdictions. So Kenya and Nigeria both have data protection regimes in place, and we're currently working with those as well. And then, of course, as an organization, what we've done is we've gone through it, and we've mapped out exactly what our roadmap looks like for privacy compliance. And starting with the leftmost column, we looked at ensuring that we firstly identify where all of our risks lie. The second phase is getting into implementing all the controls that we need to get compliant. And the final one being the fact that compliance is a journey and you're never quite there. So we look at ensuring that we are continuously compliant and we continuously meet the standards that we need to meet. So from a pragmatic perspective, what I advise a lot of small to medium businesses to do is that they put together a tactical approach to ensure that they are compliant, where they look at the absolute highest risks that are within their organization. They map those out and they address those as, I guess, quick wins or primary priorities that they have, and ensure that they get those in place first, and then they tackle each of the nuances of POPI, because as we know, strict compliance is required firstly, and secondly, your efforts towards compliance will be measured when there's a compliance fine or notice that will be issued. So just a few key tips from me in terms of, things that you can perhaps, work through and work towards.
That's an excellent, excellent graphic. Wow.
I'm happy to share this, with the attendees as well, with their consent, should they request it.
Perhaps what we could suggest, Imran, given that I'm really impressed with it, perhaps you could post it on your LinkedIn page if you wish, or we can add it to our mailing list.
Absolutely.
And send this
I'm happy
out.
to.
Yeah.
I'd prefer to send it through to you, Lucian. You can send it out to the attendees that request it.
Perfect.
All right. And then, unfortunately, we don't have a formalized process of auditing our vendors' privacy compliance. It's very ad hoc at the moment. Ad hoc meaning it comes to me and I review every single one of them, which is the case, unfortunately, with many smaller organizations where there's formalized processes and things are not yet established. Unfortunately, that needs to be done. The other one that I'm quite big on is the privacy awareness program, and that was my very first action that I took when I joined TourVest. I recognized that the biggest risk any organization faces when it comes to data breaches and cyber breaches is people, and we've got multiple levels of individuals in our organization. We've got warehouse staff, we've got office employees, we've got employees that operate on airlines, we've got exco members, everyone. So what I did was I set up baseline training for every single business area. We did 2 hours of face-to-face training on information, cybersecurity, and privacy. And then I had I set up onboarding training for employees, for new employees. I set up managerial training. I set up exco training for our exco members. And then what we do is we do we do a continuous training every 6 months to ensure that everyone is sharp and everyone understands the requirements. And in getting that privacy message across, what I found is especially relevant is getting people to care about their own privacy first. So showing them the risks related to their own privacy, which is what you'll see a lot of on my LinkedIn as well. It's recognizing that your own data has a certain inherent value attached to it. And if that privacy is eroded, you have no control of that. It's a slippery slope from there in terms of what organizations will do with your data. We've looked at a few strategies. We looked at gamification, making mobile games that we can use for employees to play with incentives. I like how Peter mentioned that your internet gets cut off at discovery. I don't think that's an incentive. I think that's more of the stick than the carrot. I like to go with the carrot approach before we pull out the stick. So we offer incentives and bonuses and time off and prizes for completing quizzes on privacy and information security first before we issue any sanctions on it. So I prefer to take the softer approach initially. I guess maybe that's why my privacy program is not as effective as his. But
well, I wouldn't be doing any work with all the games that you have.
And then the other thing that's quite important at the moment is we've seen the rise of digital video. So with platforms like TikTok and Instagram Live and Instagram, we've recognized that people's attention spans are really short. So if you're able to parcel your privacy training into short 30-second clips, with distilling each of the privacy requirements in really short bite-sized chunks, people are a lot more receptive to that because of the format and the way they've been conditioned by social media, unfortunately. So that works pretty well for me. I'm actually planning a series of videos myself. I'm thinking of doing a series of videos distilling privacy topics and setting up my own YouTube channel. I've gotten a fair bit of interest on it, so I'm looking at doing that. But again, that'll be very basic. There won't be advice for organizations. It'll be a lot of personal privacy. It's my personal project that I intend getting into. So I've recognized that video is the medium to get into. And then
before you go ahead, I see and I'm going to let our attendees into a bit of banter that's going on here. You mentioned TikTok, so of course, Peter, taking a dig at you, is saying, "Are you going to put those videos on TikTok?" Clearly, a dig at privacy.
So being the information security officer at Tourvest, I've got a lot of authority to make some very broad decisions, and one of those decisions that I made was to ban TikTok within our organization and on all our networks. And that's not because I dislike it or because I'm a disgruntled millennial who doesn't understand Generation Z. It's because TikTok is a huge privacy risk. So I had a colleague of mine send me some info on a guy who disassembled the TikTok app, and it found that the TikTok app itself was recording all of your touches on your phone, the other apps that you had installed on your device. It was recording, it was pinging servers in China in the middle of the night. It was doing all kinds of nefarious things that I wasn't comfortable with. Also, the fact that it was activating your mic and your video at odd times of the night and day. It's a horrible app, and it's controlled by Chinese state media companies, and I really don't want that kind of potential corporate espionage in my organization. So I banned that along with Zoom a couple of months ago, because Zoom had very similar privacy and security issues. So to answer Peter, no, that won't go on TikTok, unfortunately. It may go on LinkedIn and YouTube, but you won't find me on TikTok. And then with regard to managing data breaches, and I've got a sweeping comment here, and I think everyone should take this one quite seriously. With the rise of people working from home and remote work, it's not a matter of if you're going to have a data breach, what you're going to do. It's a matter of when that data breach will hit your organization. If you're an organization processing any sensitive data or with any amount of monetizable data that you have stored, it's a matter of when black hat hackers or bad actors are going to target your organization, and they're doing that more and more. So I've seen it in my organization, on a recurring basis, and there's been a sharp rise in the amount of spear phishing. So spear phishing is a particular type of phishing where hackers will target employees, for example, within your finance department, because they know that they make payments. And it's very easy to ascertain that. There's something known as OSINT. It's open source intelligence. If I had to Google your name, you would pick up all your social media, and through that you would find out what you do and what your role is, and you would pick up someone's email address and you would target a phishing email to that person particularly. So we've seen a lot of that in my organization. I've had to set up firewall rules to block certain senders. I've had to I've got an awareness program where I send out a weekly mailer to every single person in the organization, including the CEO, with the current risks, with emerging trends that I've seen in cybersecurity and cyber risk. And that's helped to stamp out a lot of those things. It's also made everyone very averse to absolutely anything that they receive. Unfortunately, it's oversensitized them. So they send me a lot of those emails, asking whether it's legitimate. Thankfully, there are a lot of them that they've picked up, and that our scanners have picked up, and that our providers have picked up, that are phishing attempts and hacking attempts and ransomware attempts. A lot of that has come through as well. So we've caught a lot of that. But there's also a lot more, and we've seen a proliferation of that because of the work from home situation, because people at home are far more complacent. They're less likely to pop around to the next office to ask their information security officer whether an email is legitimate. So we've actually seen that. So on a practical level, your privacy and information security risks are far greater at the moment, and they will be for the next for the long term. With regard to how you deal with data breaches, so what I've done is I've absolutely looked at it on a very serious level, because in our group, so we're a group of about 40 entities, and we had 2 very serious data breaches in the past few years. And what I've done is I've spoken to the teams that have dealt with those breaches, and I've ensured that my division particularly, we draft a very comprehensive, up-to-date incident response plan to address as many possible incidents as we possibly can. So ransomware, phishing attacks, malware, corporate espionage, all of those things. So we've actually drafted those. We do regular tabletop exercises where we look at, running an exercise through and deciding, how we're going to deal with it. you've got to ensure that all your roles and responsibilities are up to date and accurate. You've got to ensure that it's properly communicated to absolutely everyone in the organization, so everyone knows about it. And exactly what Peter was saying earlier, I'm the guy that they're going to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning. So if I don't have a process in place, a response plan in place, if I don't have really good breach communication templates ready to go for our PR officer to put out, I'm going to be in trouble and I'm going to be scrambling for it. But it gives me a lot of comfort to know that I've already put those in place, and that they're workable, actionable, and that they're up to date as possible. And yeah, that's about it from me. So having that in place gives me a lot of comfort. And I guess to Peter's point again, it should give our data subjects a lot of confidence, given that we are actively working on a lot of these things and we consider privacy and information security paramount.
Yeah, Imran, it sounds like you really are on top of your game, and the fact that you have to take GDPR into consideration leads me to think that you probably have a much stricter and higher standards within your organization. What I did want to find out is the POPIA provides for information officers and deputy information officers. Now, in an organization like yours, would you consider appointing a deputy information officer? Are you the deputy information officer? Just for organizations of your size, how would you deal with that requirement? Have you given it some thought? And if you have, please give us your insights into that.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Lucian. And at the moment, my board is looking at the appointment of the information officer after I've sent them the draft appointment regulations from the information regulator, and it's very likely that I'll be wearing another hat in the next few weeks, and I'll be the information officer within my organization. And while that's very nice and fuzzy, and it's a good role to have, it also comes with a lot of accountability and responsibility. And if people are doing things that are untoward with the data in my organization, I really don't want to be arrested for that. So I'm going to have to be very careful. I'm going to have to tread very carefully, and I'm going to have to consider that appointment as well. And yeah, we do have resources within our organization. And in terms of spreading the load, I would certainly be looking at appointing deputies to handle things like data subject access requests, and handling things like updates to our policies and that kind of thing.
Okay, excellent. No, I appreciate that, because I expect as time goes by, that's going to become a major focus of organizations, how they actually appoint or whether they actually appoint deputy information officers. And I suspect that a lot of it will depend on the organization's size, its resources. I saw a statistic a week ago where IAAP estimates that there's going to be a need for about 75,000. I've just gone blank as to what they're called under GDPR, but information officers in Europe. So yeah, it sounds like it's going to be a profession in itself.
Absolutely. So I'm really keen on tracking that. And just to answer a final question with regard to your data subject access requests, which I may have skipped earlier. In the 12 months that I've been with the organization, I just want to put it on record that I've got exactly one data subject access request.
Wow. Okay. So you're not very much like Peter's organization, Discovery. You're not getting much at all, I see. Okay. So I expect it will pick up.
Look. So, I'm under.
Go ahead.
Lucian. Yeah. So I'm under no illusion that it will stay that way. It will absolutely pick up in the near future. I'm certain of that. Especially with POPIA coming into full effect, and a lot of our portals going full digital. So we're going to go digital with a lot of the services and products that we offer. A lot of our e-commerce sites are going live. A lot of that's going to come through in the near future, and I'm sure it will burgeon at some point.
Before you go, we have one question which I think I'm not sure if you'd be able to answer, but you've mentioned PCI and it's from Chandan, who says, what is the data dynamics through POPIA applicable for financial transactions, say money transfer data? Is that something you're able to comment on?
Lucien, sorry, you're breaking up. Can you call out that comment again, because I don't seem to see it?
Sure. It's from Chandan, and he says, what is the data dynamics through POPIA applicable for financial transactions? For example, say money transfer data.
So Chandan, thanks for that question. I'm not sure what you're trying to get to with data dynamics through POPIA, but POPIA regulates personal information, and that personal information includes financial information as long as it's tied to data subjects. So there are absolutely, implications for that as well.
Great. Imran, I appreciate the time you've taken out to give us some insights. I've certainly learned a lot. I'm going to definitely go and Google or DuckDuckGo OSINT and find out more about that. So we really appreciate your time. To our attendees, if you really want to be at the forefront of what's going on and see comments on the most recent developments, I remember the issue of Zoom that came out, and Imran was one of the first to comment on it. Likewise, TikTok. So if you want to be on the cusp of what is happening, I suggest you go and send him an invite on LinkedIn, because that's where all this really cutting edge information can be found. But Imran, thank you so much for your time. A lot of what you've said today is certainly new to me, and I've learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Likewise, thank you so much, Lucien. Thank you for the time, and thank you for offering me the platform. I'm really happy to be on, and I'm really happy to share a platform with you as well. So if ever you'd like me to come on and speak again, I'm really happy to do that. Have a wonderful day, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, so Imran's given us quite good insights into what his organization has done, and likewise Peter has also. And much of what we're going to go through now in the next few slides is essentially what Imran has told us. So I'm going to get back to sharing my screen with you. And here we go. And I'm hoping you can see my screen. Great. Okay, so on to our next slide. And Imran mentioned this in part of his talk, and that's essentially to plan your privacy governance program. What is that? Privacy governance. In plain English, it's basically how you deal with the data in your organization, how you ensure that from the time it arrives to the time that it leaves, that it's taken care of in accordance with the law. What's important as your starting point is you need to get to know what laws, not just POPIA, but what other laws might affect privacy in your sector, because not only do you need to plan for POPIA, but you need to incorporate what the other laws require. You might be in the health services sector, and you might need to look at the relevant health legislation. Imran also mentioned PCI standards that you would probably need to look at as well. If you are in perhaps the ISP sector, RICA might apply. So those are some of the pieces of legislation that you would need to look at. He mentioned GDPR. You would need to assess whether it applies to your organization. One of GDPR's provisions says that if you are targeting data subjects in the EU, actively targeting them, then you are subject to GDPR. So you need to do an exercise to determine what laws apply to you. Perhaps also look at applicable codes of conduct in your sector. You will, if you look at POPIA, you will see that it has a section that says that industry bodies can actually approach the information regulator and get codes of conduct approved for their sectors. So determine whether there are any codes of conduct that apply to your sector. At this particular point in time, given that POPIA has only been effective for about a month, I doubt there are any codes of conduct, but I am quite sure that in the course of the next few months, we will certainly see progress towards industry bodies trying to get their codes of conduct approved. So you also need to perhaps consider what framework you're going to use in your organization. And again, that might sound like something that is foreign, but essentially the framework is a list or a guide that will tell you what you should be taking care of within your organization, how you notify people of your privacy policy, how you secure their information. These frameworks will give you some guidance on the steps you need to take. There are lots of them out there. Some of the main ones, Imran mentioned ISO 27 and its privacy element as well. There's also a North American standard called Generally Accepted Privacy Practice, or GAP. It has 10 main areas that will guide you as to what you should be doing to become privacy compliant. And then there's also NIST, which is also an American standard. So look at those frameworks and take either the entire framework, or many people don't realize this, but you don't have to subscribe to a framework. You can take elements of each framework, so elements of each guide, and use those within your organization's privacy governance plan. And over to our next slide. So you're not going to be able to implement a privacy governance program without having somebody or some people to assist you to do that. So what you would need to do is design your privacy team. You need to look at people who are have certain skills. Of course, you would want to have people from your IT department. If you have one, your HR department, you would want to make sure that management are involved if you are not management yourself. Importantly, if you're the head of your organization, you are the information officer. POPIA says that automatically whoever, POPIA and PIA, that's another piece of legislation, but I'm just going to talk about POPIA because they talk to each other. Just for your information, if you're not from South Africa, there are two laws, and I'm digressing a little. We have one called the Promotion of Access to Information Act, which deals with facilitating an individual's access to his or her information. And then we have the Protection of Personal Information Act, and they are linked in how they deal with information. So essentially, what these laws say is that every organization has an information officer, and what POPIA also says is that you can appoint deputy information officers. So if you're a large organization and you're starting your privacy governance plan, then you need to bring all these different skills and people into that team. What you also need to do is you need to try and embed a privacy culture within your organization. So typically, I'm going to, I believe you can't see me, okay. All right. Hopefully I'll be back on the screen soon. There we go. So I thought I'd give you a view of Joburg for a few minutes. Great. So in addition to having your information officers or your deputy information officers, what you might want to have in your organization are POPIA champions. So you'd have these main leads, the information officer or deputy information officer. But within departments, if you're a large organization, you would want to appoint someone who is going to oversee and be your POPIA champion within that particular division or department. That's the person who's going to motivate their colleagues within the department or division and ensure that POPIA and whatever process you're rolling out is applied consistently and continuously. Okay, so designing your privacy compliance plan. The starting point is you need to establish what the state is on the ground. You need to find out what data you have, how it enters your organization, what is done with it while it is in your organization, how it leaves your organization, and how you destroy it once you are lawfully obliged to do so. So that gives you an idea of what is happening. If you think about any organization, most organizations would have what we call unstructured data. Think about what's sitting on your computer desktop, as you would have seen on my desktop a few minutes ago. That is unstructured data, not very good, but that might be lying all over your organization. You might have backup tapes, if people still use backup tapes, lying around. You might have redundant laptops and notebook computers that are lying around with data on them. Those are just simple examples of where data will be all over your organization. So you need to map it out and find out how that data moves through your organization. Once you've established that, you need to undergo what we call a gap assessment, which is essentially looking at your organization and determining where there are gaps or problems as far as complying with POPIA is concerned. So, for example, to use the example of Section 7, it's actually, Section 19 of POPIA, which deals with information security. So Peter mentioned that you would probably go through a process of auditing, if you want to call it that, or verifying what the status of the security is in your organization, and that would identify any gaps. Do you have secure passwords? Do you have appropriate screen locks on your computers? Do you have a proper information security policy in place that regulates how your colleagues and staff deal with their devices outside of the office? Once that gap assessment is done, you would then know what you need to do to remedy all these gaps in your organization. Importantly, if you're engaging in a new service or a new product, you might also want to look at what impact it has on privacy. And we call that a privacy impact assessment. So make sure you conduct that. Don't do it after the fact when you find out that there are all kinds of problems in the product that you're offering, and you now have to spend a whole lot of more time and effort to remedy those weaknesses from a privacy perspective. So this is a long list of policies, but it shouldn't intimidate you. This is typically what you would find in an organization of a medium to large size. It's a long list, but for smaller organizations, what you could potentially do is to distill all the main issues that are in each of these policies into a much shorter policy and procedure type document. But if I can run you through this, you'll see that the privacy policy is right at the top. So smaller organizations could essentially have one simple policy, and within that, it would deal with each of the other policies that you see on that list. But very quickly, governance and accountability policy, that would essentially look at how the organization deals with its data. And Peter mentioned that that is what they've done within their organization. An incident management policy, essentially very much like what Imran mentioned, where if things go wrong, you're able to address that in an orderly and organized fashion that's not going to result in more issues for you. Your PIA manual, Promotion of Access to Information Act manual. There was frenetic activity when the Promotion of Access to Information Act came out many years ago, and many organizations developed a PIA manual, and as the law says, they've put it on their website. But what's important to remember is that POPIA has now added further requirements and further provisions to your PIA manual, so you would need to update yours if you have one already. Imran mentioned, and so did Peter, that they've dealt with very few data subject access requests, but you need to have a policy or a procedure and a procedure in place as to how you deal with requests that come in. How do you deal with them once they arrive? Who does it go to? Who responds? Who assesses whether it's a legitimate request or not? And also, importantly, and this one is the one where you could potentially experience really serious fines, and this is children's personal information or special personal information and the policy that governs how you process that. Remember, children's personal information is in a higher category, a more sensitive category. So those two groups of data, you need to ensure that you have a policy that governs how you deal with that. So here's a very practical example. We were assisting an organization that had a really good bursary program. And in that, part of that process was essentially children applying for bursaries through their website. And of course, they didn't realize that in terms of POPIA, how you deal with that information needs to be dealt with in a different way, given the sensitivity. So sometimes we overlook these aspects. A retention and destruction policy. Don't forget that you're obliged to keep information for a certain period of time, but at the same time, you also are obliged to destroy information at a certain point, because you shouldn't be keeping it indefinitely. So you need to have a policy that governs how that is dealt with. There are some organizations that might also have what we call a legal hold process in place. So you need to make sure that your policy includes aspects of that. Legal hold is basically where litigation is started and your opponent then asks you to keep certain information and not destroy it. Because your policy might say, after 5 years, we destroy a certain type of information. But of course, once litigation starts, you'd have to keep it beyond that. So take that into account if you're a larger organization. Importantly, clean desk policies. I was assisting a national key point. And if you're aware of South African law, it's essentially a state organization that is in a much higher security category in terms of how it operates and what information you can have access to from that particular body. And I happened to be taken through a very general area as we were going into a very sensitive section of this organization. But walking through that area was a whole lot of desktop computers, probably 80% of which were unattended, but I could see what was on the screens. So as much as it's not a desk, you would want to have some sort of policy in place that makes sure that your screens are locked. So any papers lying around would need to be taken care of. So these are very practical and what might seem very obvious policies, but in certain organizations, you would need to ensure that you have them in place given the sensitivity of the types of information you have. Contract management policy, both Peter and Imran mentioned this. You need to make sure that in dealing with subcontractors, that you obtain the appropriate undertakings and indemnities from them. The example I gave at the very beginning was of Nedbank and its service provider. That incident was dealt with very well, in my opinion, by Nedbank. They were very transparent in the way they dealt with the information. But of course, in this instance, I would have hoped that they would have had the appropriate contractual undertakings in place. And like Peter mentioned, I would have hoped that they would have done the necessary site inspections to make sure that whatever security requirements that had been made in the contract were in fact being implemented within the organization. So information sharing policy, to use Imran's example, they have entities in other jurisdictions, the UK he mentioned. So in that instance, how do they transfer information between their various organizations and also with outside organizations? That whole process also needs to be governed. If something goes wrong, you're going to find that the information regulator is going to be asking questions like that. What is your policy with regard to sharing information? Is it regulated? So very importantly, take note of that. And likewise, cross-border transfer policy. Does your organization take into account the fact that you might be sending personal information through to a country that doesn't have adequate data protection laws? That is absolutely crucial. And for those of you who don't know, the EU, for example, had a law in place, or an arrangement in place with the United States called Privacy Shield, and that allowed data to be transferred, personal information to be transferred from the EU to the US. That was recently struck down, so they can't rely on that anymore and need to assess how personal information is now going to be transferred to the United States, but for them to still stay within the law. And then, of course, security and access management policy. That, of course, is obvious. You need to make sure that your systems are in place to protect devices, and not just devices. We still have paper, we still have files. If you think about most organizations would have an HR department, or if you don't have a department, you'd have an HR cupboard. Is it locked? Are the files that hold the sensitive information of your employees secure, and is it limited to certain people? So those are some of the policies that you would need to put in place. Importantly, you need to ensure that you're also protecting the rights of data subjects. These are the individuals that you deal with every day and the companies that you deal with every day. That's a unique aspect of POPIA in that companies or legal entities are also afforded protection under POPIA. Look at whether you have the appropriate notices on your websites, a privacy policy at least. Are you obtaining consent, appropriate consent for the use of information, and are you giving data subjects the choice of whether it can be used or not? We mentioned the PIA manual earlier. Make sure that you have one and make sure that it's up to date now that certain changes to it are required. Data subject information access policy. How do you deal with that request? I've seen in recent times very innovative and useful software that it almost automates the process up to a particular point of that data subject access request. So like just to follow on to that, you need to have the procedures in place as well. And how are you going to handle complaints that have been filed with the regulator? You need to also have some sort of process and procedure, or policy and procedure in place to make sure that happens smoothly as well. Because if you're handling personal information, there is a likelihood at some point that somebody will file a complaint against you. Security safeguards, really important. Protecting the information is a legal requirement. I had mentioned section 19 to 23 of POPIA. If you want to know what it says, it deals with all the security aspects. It also deals with aspects related to subcontractors and how you need to deal with them. There are certain frameworks, as we mentioned earlier, that govern information security. Look at those frameworks. Sometimes they might be a bit too cumbersome for smaller organizations. So essentially distill the most important aspects and what is most relevant to you, and use that if you are a smaller organization. Examples of technical and organizational measures, because that is what POPIA says. It says you must put in place technical and organizational measures to protect personal information. Look at things like encryption, access control, de-identification, which is basically where you make personal information, anonymize it permanently. There's a bit of a debate as to whether anonymize is permanent de-identification, but that's getting a bit technical. So essentially what that means is removing the data from the personal data in such a way, or deleting it so that you can't recognize the individual. And also looking at secure destruction. Do you get a reputable shredding company to come in and shred paper in accordance with minimum standards? How do you dispose of paper that you throw into your bin? Is it simply thrown outside? There have been instances in different jurisdictions where doctors' rooms have been fined substantially for simply dumping old medical records into the bin. And of course, when an inspection is done, that personal information, sensitive personal information, was found. So look at those policies and don't think of this as simply an IT thing, because this applies to records, and records could include photographs, photocopies, maps. There's a very wide definition as to how you deal with personal information. And then, of course, it was either Imran or Peter who mentioned that one of the weakest links are the individuals within the organization. And POPIA obliges and requires you to train your staff to ensure that they are aware of its requirements. So training is absolutely crucial. In a smaller organization, you might have a once-a-year session where a simple PowerPoint is done or a talk is done, identifying what your organization's requirements are, and also identifying some of the ways in which breaches occur. That might be sufficient in a small organization. We've assisted large organizations to have comprehensive training policies where, for example, they've had specialized videos, they've had online quizzes, They've had a poster campaign across the organization. So those are the aspects that you should look at and tailor it to the size of your organization, and use different channels as well if you can, because people might miss posters, but they might see a pop-up on the computer during the course of the day or when they sign in to the organization. So handling data breaches. This is one that certainly many organizations get wrong. The one aspect that we regularly see is a data breach is publicized, and then the organization simply goes silent. Not a word comes out of them. That's the worst thing you can do, and that's how I'll open up. It's about being communicative and not being secretive in dealing with this. Now, if you look at that infographic over there, you'll see that there are there've been huge breaches. You look at Facebook, you look at Marriott Hotels who received a major fine. They happen all the time. And like I mentioned earlier, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when your data breach happens. So consider having a solid plan in place. Imran mentioned that he has a plan in place. So let's see how you should deal with your internet is slow. There we go. Great. So how should you, or what should your response be in the case of an incident? So the incident occurs. First step, assess the situation. That's what Imran says. Investigate the incident if you can, as quickly as you can. Assess the damage, compile an incident report, and communicate it to whoever is concerned, particularly the data subjects. Now, remember, keeping silent and hoping that it's going to go away isn't going to work. There's also another aspect that I'd like you to take note of, and perhaps this is a lesson that a client of ours learned, a very difficult lesson. A major client that processes very sensitive information essentially had their entire data center deleted or wiped by a disgruntled employee. This happened on the eve of a holiday, so nobody was around to take note, and the employee very wisely went in and out, knowing that employee's credentials had not been changed, so logged in and destroyed the entire data center. What did they do? They immediately got on the line with one of the best forensics teams in the UK, who flew out, came and did a wonderful investigation and managed to identify the source or the culprit involved. But of course, what then happened was that this report was handed over, and there were certain queries regarding it. Now, what we had said to our client when we went in afterwards was that, and this is not punting for work for lawyers, but essentially, had the attorneys who are vested with privilege, legal privilege, appointed the forensic investigators to do the investigation, in that instance, that report would be privileged as well. So if it is ever found out that this incident occurred, and of course not many people know about it, but in that instance, that report would be privileged and would not be capable of being handed over or could not be demanded in the event of litigation. So think about how you go forward with your investigations, and make sure you do it in such a way that that investigation and its outcome is protected legally, and that you don't have to give over whatever it is that you find, because the outcome might be that your organization was grossly negligent, and do you want to be forced to hand such a damning report over to opponents in the case of litigation? So prepare for this incident. Imran gave you basically some steps and what you should do to prepare for this. Know who is on the team, know how you're going to react, and make sure that everybody is aware of what their roles are. Dr. Peter mentioned that they have a dry run, if I could call it that, at least once a year. Try and do that and make sure that everybody is aware so that there's no confusion when an incident like this happens. So what are your reporting obligations? And POPIA is a little strange, and I'll explain why in a minute. Take GDPR. GDPR is very stringent and essentially requires you to report within 72 hours of becoming aware of the breach. There are certain situations where you are not obliged to report within 72 hours. But in the case of POPIA, it says that you should report as soon as reasonably possible after discovery of the compromise. So what does that mean? It does seem to give you some leeway to investigate and obtain more information as to what happened with regard to the breach. But this is the interesting one now. So you have the responsible party, who is the person who is in charge of that personal information. It then perhaps subcontracts that information to a third-party subcontractor or service provider. In that instance, if there's a breach with that third party called the operator, they have to notify the responsible party immediately. So no time for investigation or any delays. So that is quite an interesting distinction, in that the operator is obliged to report to the responsible party, whereas the responsible party has a bit more leeway. There might be some rationale for it, but it's just a little distinction that you need to be aware of, particularly if you're the responsible party. Make sure that you place an obligation on your subcontractor to report to you immediately. It's in any event required by the law, but you might want to reinforce that in any agreements that you conclude. So as far as that is concerned, make sure that you're knowledgeable, you're up to date, you have a policy in place, and that you're able to address breaches when they occur. I suspect that when the information regulator starts enforcing and monitoring, once the grace period is up, I have a feeling that in those instances, they are going to come in with a very strict approach. I do think that they are going to make examples of some organizations. You do not want to be that organization. You want to be the one that is able to say, I'm ready and I've done everything that I can. So even in the event of something happening, you'll be able to show that you've done everything that is reasonable. And in that instance, the likely outcome of any investigation will simply be a slap on the hand. So do what you need to. You've got 11 months. You've got plenty of time. Of course, there was a question earlier. In bigger organizations, you're really pushing it if you haven't started already, but it can be done. So don't delay. Start today. If there are any questions, I'm going to hang around for another minute or two. You're welcome to put any questions on the chat. For anyone who's commented or who has addressed any questions to us, as long as you've put something in the chat, then we are going to make sure that you get our plan for POPIA guide. Okay, so we're going to go out in about a minute. Any questions? Now's your last chance. Okay, so I'm going to address, there is a question here. It says, if you are part of a group, would you advise one IO at group level and deputies per company, or does each entity need its own IO? So what you can actually do is you could have a single IO at group level and have deputies, because responsible parties, essentially those processing personal information, are entitled to actually outsource the role of an IO. So you could easily have that one IO at group level with some deputies at the company level, or you could have almost a shared services center where in one entity all those IO duties are performed. So you can structure it in different ways. All depends on what you're hoping to achieve and whether you want to engage in cost savings. See another comment, another question. Thank you, Anonymous. There are some, I see you've taken some notes. Yes, well, even though you are anonymous, we will find you and we will get that plan for POPIA guide to you. Essentially, what we are going to do is we are going to send that guide during the course of next week to all people who attended today. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all for attending. I hope it was informative. And I'd like to thank our two speakers, Dr. Peter and Imran, for coming in to share their experiences and their knowledge. This video will be made available. It will be put onto our YouTube page. You'll also find it on LinkedIn. For more updates on our next webinars, and also generally for developments as and when they happen in the ICT law space, go to our LinkedIn page now and follow us. You'll be sure to be kept up to date on all developments in the sector. Again, thank you for making the time to join us. And I wish you a pleasant day and see you at the next webinar. Take care and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.